Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics, another video in the GunFu series. As promised, this is part 2 of the Flipping the Bozo Bit series, and I'm going to talk in depth a little bit about something called moron statistics. And I'm sorry in advance to those of you that are going to find this boring, but this is one of those things to me, like I've said before, that I would much rather spend my time tending the crops, tending the garden, growing the flowers, growing the vegetables. But if I'm going to do that, every once in a while, you've got to tend to the weeds, or the weeds are going to overtake everything else. And when someone begins expressing opinions as a way of, I don't know, aggrandizing themselves or making it sound like they're the only firearms trainer in the world that knows what they're doing, and they do so on the basis of deeply innumerate, illogical, ignorant reasoning, I'm not so much trying to call that person out. I am a little bit, I suppose, but at the same time, what really bothers me is that level of reasoning has no place in these kinds of discussions about the quality of training that people receive or don't receive. Now, here's what I'm talking about. There's a gentleman, he runs a firearms place back in Indiana. I'm not going to mention him by name because A, I'm not trying to actually insult him personally, although I have a feeling he'll probably see this and will be insulted. Sorry. And I also don't want to draw attention to his school because I think that you should not be attending a school that is run by somebody who so demonstrably has no idea what he's talking about and bases his training methods upon the things that he has no idea that he's talking about. And it goes a little bit like something like this. He made a 35-minute video here on YouTube. It doesn't matter if you call him out by name in the comments section. I'm going to delete it because it's not about him. It's about the principle of the thing. Made a video where he talked about why everybody else's training is unrealistic, and it goes something like this. Well, there's something called the hit ratio. It's the hit ratio. And he uses that term as though it's some force of nature or natural law like gravity that none of us can escape. And that is based on national statistics from police organizations, according to him, that say something like only 20% of rounds fired in a, call it what you will, a critical incident, a self-defense incident, a police engagement. Only about 20% of those find their mark, that they hit a person, okay? And I have some problems with that statistic, but we'll talk about those in a bit. But let's just say that it's 20%. Now he says, of those 20%, and he treats that 20% number like that's all the better that anybody can do. Your hit ratio is going to be 20%. Out of that 20% number, if we blew that up as a group, that only 20% of that group now would be cases where someone died from their gunshot wounds, and that's because we're talking about handguns, and handguns are underpowered. We all know that. Anybody with a brain would rather have a rifle, but you can't carry those around as much. They're not as concealable, they're not as easy to have on your person at all times. But, okay, so we know handguns aren't that great as a firearm, and that, okay, here's this statistic that says people shot with a handgun, only 20% of them die. Okay, we say, okay, 20% of the rounds hit, 20% of those result in a case where someone dies, and I have a problem with the way that statistic is being kind of fudged with. And that out of that, we took that group up, the number that die, blew that up, and we said, all right, it's even a small percentage of those that are instant stops, meaning that you shoot them and they are physiologically prevented from continuing, and the only thing that will amount in a total physiological stop, an instant one anyway, is a shot right about through this area here that is lucky enough to make it all the way back to the brainstem or the medulla oblongata or the upper spine, the upper part of the central nervous system, and because that'll cut off communications with everything below. You hit somebody in the neck, and if it actually hits them in the spine and it shuts off everything below it, yeah, that pretty much stops it unless they're going to try and bite you to death. I don't even know how that works. And so there's some sense to that notion. But then based upon that, he says, and for that reason, 90% of the training out there doesn't cover the situations that you're going to get involved in. Well, now wait a minute. If 90% doesn't cover it, then that means that what's left over is 10%. Even if you do the math using the figures that are used, 20% of 20% is 4%, and you're saying that even a smaller group than that is the percentage that are an instant stop. So I don't know where 90% and 10% come up as numbers, but it reveals on some level that you're not really engaging in some great mathematical thinking there. You're not engaging in a level of, frankly, high school level mathematics that's anything other than embarrassingly bad. You can't even seem to do the simple math and come out with a figure that we can wrap our heads around. The implication that somehow there's a 90% of what everybody teaches out there doesn't matter and only 10% does, and that for that reason you're the only trainers who train realistically. There's no intervening logic there. You haven't said anything except thrown out some raw factoids, some raw statistics. You've related them together in a way that doesn't even make sense, and you don't even get the math right. That's not something to base your training program or your criticism of other training programs upon. Not if you have the sense that God gave geese. Now I want to dive into these statistics individually for you because I want to show you that even individually, applying them in the way that they're being applied doesn't make a lick of sense. First of all, let's talk about this thing that I've referred to as the ratio. Well, the ratio is simply the percentage of hits that have been recognized over time, and this data has been collated by the FBI, of firearms, of instances where police have employed their firearms and the number of rounds out of 10 or out of 100 that hit. It's a percentage, okay? And this gentleman says that that ratio is 20%. Now, setting aside for a moment the fact that what police do and what citizens do and what the military do are very, very different things, which he kind of half acknowledges later in the video and kind of sidesteps, really, in a way. That 20% figure is meaningless because, as anyone with kind of like a high school or a first year of college knowledge of statistics will tell you, the only time an average or a mean tells you anything about a data set is when there's a fairly normalized distribution of data. And a normalized distribution of data is one that's kind of in a bell curve where most of the data points are actually clustered around this area in the bell in the middle, and there's very little of those data points that are in the outlying sections. Okay? That 20% figure, first of all, is incorrect according to the FBI. I'm going to get a little picky here. That percentage is 18%, and it's been that, it's even worse, see, over a number of years that the FBI has collected these statistics. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because we know when we look into those statistics deeper that the cluster of data does not center around the middle of that bell curve. It's all over. It's distributed all over the place. So even using an average doesn't make sense if you want to talk about this in a statistically numerate fashion, one that is logical and true to the data. Now, I have a background in metrology. I have a background as a test engineer. This is my wheelhouse. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm the greatest world expert on statistics, but if you have a workmanlike knowledge of a subject, you know when somebody's making something up and using crap inconsistently or incorrectly, and you know when they don't. It's one of these things that's really, really obvious to you if you have to work with metrology and statistics on a daily basis like I do. How does the data really get distributed? Well, it doesn't get distributed in that normalized fashion with the bell curve. It's all over the map, as I said, and I'll give you some statistics in here that will show that. But just to show you the principle, say we had a Girl Scout troop, and we said, well, last year, we got 5 girls in our troop. Last year, we sold 100 boxes of cookies. And this year, we want to increase our sales by 10%. So we want to sell, 2 more boxes of cookies per girl. So instead of 100 boxes of cookies for our little troop, we want to sell 110 boxes of cookies. So we're going to increase everybody's quota. We're going to ask every girl to sell 22 boxes. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we added up the number of sales we had last year. It was 100 boxes exactly. We divided that by the girls, by the number of girls, 5 of them. That comes to 20 boxes on average per girl. And we want to increase that by 10% and give that as the goal for these girls. Increase your sales by 10%. And, selling 2 more boxes of cookies should be pretty easy, right? Well, that's fine, again, if that data is all clustered around the center there and all the girls sold somewhere around 20 boxes of cookies or so. But if we look in the data and we find out, whoa, wait a minute, there's an outlier over here that sold 50 boxes of cookies last year. This one girl sold 50 boxes of cookies. And over here, we've got a cluster of 4 girls that sold 11, 12, 13, and 14 cookies. That makes 50 altogether. Altogether, those 4 girls sold $50 of cookies. The data is sitting out here, not clustered in here in a bell curve. So giving this goal of 20 boxes of cookies per girl is meaningless to our problem. Because this girl over here, either she's a great salesperson, in which case that goal is meaningless to her. She may not even try hard to sell the 50 that she sold last year, because after all, 22 is the quota, right? Or it could be the case that she just got really, really lucky last year, and this year her sales are going to be more like these girls would normally be, 11, 12, 13, 14 boxes per girl. And for these poor girls down here, telling the girl that sold 11 or 12 boxes of cookies last year, that now this year she's expected to sell 22, is a daunting task. We just made this average have a meaning that it doesn't have at all to the problem. And it turns out that this is exactly the same kind of thing that we have when we're talking about the hit ratio with firearms instances involving police nationwide. And that involves everything from federal level officers down to the local police department and whatever. And that's because of this. We find out, for instance, if we go to the actual statistics, we find out, yeah, the percentage year to year, it usually hovers around 18% as a hit ratio. But when we go to NYPD, we find out that their hit ratio is only 11 to 15%, according to the SOP9 statistics that they keep. LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, look at this, it's clear over on the other end of the graph, 40 to 45% hit ratio in LAPD. Baltimore, their police department, reports a hit ratio of 49%. And they even break it down, interestingly. They break it into day and night, and I found this statistic really interesting. They have a 45% hit ratio in the daytime, and at night it's a 64, low light, it's a 64%. I would have expected it to be the other way around, that their hits would be worse in low light than they would be in daylight. I think it might have something to do with the fact that maybe they're being a little bit more careful at night to make sure they light up and get their sights on target before taking a shot at night, maybe something like that. But it's an interesting statistic. The FBI itself reports a hit ratio of 70%, and LAPD SWAT represents an 80% to 85% hit ratio. So again, our data is not clustered around this little, 20%, that's the ratio that all of us must live by. Nobody can train better than that. Nobody can shoot better than that. We've got to base our whole training on this made-up figure that doesn't have anything to do with the actual distribution of data when we really look at it. Now, in addition to that, we know, anecdotally at least, that from firearms instances and the data that's been collected, that your average American citizen, their hit ratio is better than the average police officer. And while that probably still has the same problem with distribution, there are probably guys out there making all of their shots, and there are probably guys out there making relatively few of them. We have to take that into account, and we also have to take into account that in some of the larger schools that have compiled statistics, we find out that the performance of their students in actual firearms instances is pretty good. Tom Givens has compiled statistics for his students and other people that are associated with his organization that have gone through some kind of, decent firearms training, the kind that's supposed to be totally unrealistic. And they show that the hit ratio among Rangemaster students is about 85%. 85% of the rounds are making their mark in those instances where their students are involved. Gunsight gathered some statistics for a while, and they were surprised to find that in some of the years where they gathered those statistics, 100% of the time their rounds found their mark with their students. Their students, I guess, were being ultra careful to make their shots. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose, as long as they lived. But they've kind of backed off of that number, not wanting to make it sound too crazy, and they've said, well, it's somewhere around 90%, and we can verify that from the instances that we've looked at. Now, is that entirely scientific? No. But it does show that this idea that there's a magical 20% hit ratio that none of us can get beyond, or that that's the number that we've got to live with, is BS. it looks, based upon what we know from these various police departments, that the police departments that train very little, like New York Police Department or the Chicago Police Department, their hit ratio is atrocious. Organizations that train far more often, like LAPD SWAT, they've got to qualify every 30 days or they're off the team. Their hit ratio is very high. And we know that at least in some instances, students of some of these firearms companies that this gentleman in Indiana says don't cover 90% of the instances out there, they're doing extremely well and better than police do in most cases. So that magical statistic is a made-up number and it's meaningless. It means nothing, and it shows a deeply innumerate and ignorant understanding of statistics to try to apply it in that way, especially if you want to pretend that it's the number that everybody has to live with. But take a look at what we do here. Even if that number were good, we now take that weird made-up, doesn't mean anything number, because we're taking a look at an average that has nothing to do with the real distribution of the data, and we're now going to say out of that number, we're going to use another statistic that was compiled, and this statistic is actually, I'll give you the real statistic. The statistic is this: people who are shot 1 or 2 times with a handgun and receive medical care in a reasonable amount of time, they will live. That's being shot 1 or 2 times with a handgun and they receive medical care in a reasonable amount of time, they're going to live. Now, the reasonable amount of time, that's hard to nail down what that really means, but from the people that I've talked to, they're ER doctors and nurses and things like that, they seem to think that it means the magic hour, if you get to somebody an hour from the incident or something like that. Well, now wait a minute. That's only cases where somebody's been shot 1 or 2 times, not 3, 4, 5 times or more. Not cases where someone keeps on shooting until they end the threat. Okay? And that is only telling us the people who died at some time later. It doesn't tell us whether or not they stopped. Later on, this guy implies that, oh, it's only the instant stops from being hit in the brain or the upper spinal cord. Those are the only ones that are stops at all. The only instant stops are instant physiological stops. This is stupid, and again, I'm sorry to say it that way, but it's so true. If you understand how you apply this information at all, I mean, even at grade school level, I don't understand the mentality of people who cannot think and want to be belligerent about their ignorant ideas. That just drives me nuts. We know that people are stopped all the time, even though it's not a physiological stop. People are stopped all the time, and we can see the data. We can look in something as simple as every month the stories in the NRA magazines where people, they shoot someone 1 or 2 times. That person isn't instantly stopped. It's not a headshot or a shot to the spine, but that person runs away. Maybe they only got shot in the arm. Maybe they only got shot in the side or someplace not vital, but they look down, they go, oh crap, I've been shot, I'm out of here. They drop the TV or they drop the knife or whatever, and they're out of there. That's a stop. That's a success. To say that that's meaningless or that's not important or that the only things that count are, hits to the brain box or the upper spine, that's stupid, because that's not realistic. That's not real life. That's not the way we know things happen. If our intent is to defend ourselves with a firearm, we are not concerned at all how or why the guy stops what he's doing. We're concerned with the fact that he stops doing it. And if we use a firearm to bring about that effect, whatever way that happens, we're happy with it. We don't, say, oh, dang, he was going to kill me and rape my dog and steal my TV, but I only hit him in the leg and he ran off. That doesn't count because it wasn't an instant physiological stop. Nor do we only say, well, I only get to shoot twice, so I'm going to base my entire training program on what happens when you shoot somebody twice and they get medical care in an hour. That's dumb too. All of this reveals a deep, deep misunderstanding of statistics, a deep misunderstanding of the realities, a deep, deep understanding of how you apply statistical information to the problem that you're trying to solve. And for that reason, if this guy wants to base a firearms training or a self-defense training program on this kind of shoddy, innumerate, illiterate, ignorant, I have to be honest, stupid understanding of what is obvious to people who, with even a basic education, I have to say that that's somebody that you probably ought to avoid. It's the kind of thing that really gets my goat, and it's the kind of thing that ought to get yours too. This is pulling out the weeds so that the good crops and the good vegetables and the good flowers can grow. That's zombie tactics for today. As always, keep your powder dry and always aim for the head. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.